Good afternoon and welcome to Mondays at Beinecke. My name is Michael Moran and I have the privilege of working in communications and community engagement at Beinecke Library and Yale Library Special Collections. Today and every day, we acknowledge that Indigenous peoples and nations, including the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, Quinnipiac, and other Algonquian-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. Today and every day, we honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations in this land. Today and every day, let us also hear and heed the voices and stories of generations past and present who have fought against racism, white supremacy, state violence, and systems of oppression, and who have fought for liberation, joy, and freedom. This afternoon session of Mondays at Beinecke features three outstanding students in Yale College. Miguel Ceballo-Countryman, a junior in Silliman College, will be talking about the proposal for a Black college in New Haven. Patrick Hayes, a sophomore in Silliman College, will be speaking on a Yale student from Virginia in the late 1830s. And Mackenzie Hawkins, a senior in Trumbull College, will be talking about the Yale Civil War Memorial. Each is a leader in our community. Miguel, for example, serves presently as co-president of the Black Student Alliance at Yale, while Mackenzie was previously the editor-in-chief of the Yale Daily News. And each were participants in a Yale College seminar, Slavery, Race, and Yale, led by professors Crystal Feemster and Edward Rugemer, along with PhD student Tianu Reed. Their course focused on the history of the relationship between Yale University and the institution of racial slavery in the United States, beginning with the founding of the university in 1701, through the era of the American Civil War, up through the end of the 19th century. The course also considered the relationship between the university and Black community of New Haven, including the living memory of enslavement. This is part of ongoing work by the Yale and Slavery Working Group, which is focused on a deep and thorough investigation of Yale's historic involvement and associations with slavery and its aftermath. The findings of the overall Yale and Slavery Working Group, of which this seminar was a part, will build a clearer and more comprehensive history of Yale and contribute to the scholarship of slavery and abolition more broadly. The working group, as you may know, was organized in late 2020 and began intensive research in 2021. It's led by David Blight, Sterling Professor of History, of African American Studies, and of American Studies, and Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center. The working group includes faculty, staff, librarians, and New Haven community members with administrative leadership from the Gilder Lehrman Center. Yale Library's special collections are at the heart of this work, and the students presenting today and their peers have made ample use of the library's resources, whether in manuscripts and archives, in the Beinecke Library, or in other repositories. Today's program features each of these three students providing a snapshot or a synopsis of their research. It will be a brief taste, as it were, of the intensive work that they've done, followed by time for questions and answer and conversation. This afternoon, again, is a sample of work in progress with more research to be done and more programs like this to come. I want to thank Miguel and Patrick and Mackenzie for the work they've done and their willingness to share it with us. To get us started, let me turn first to Miguel. Miguel, the screen and floor are yours.
Hi, well, first I want to say thank you so much for having me today. I greatly enjoyed my time in the course, but my research project primarily is focused on the history of the proposed Negro College of 1831. Specifically, I wanted to ground the story of the proposed Negro College in a history of Black activism and leadership in New Haven during the 1830s and the time period. So first, just a brief context of the proposed Negro College before we dive in. In 1830, a group of notable members of the free Black community in New York began the process of conceiving of an institution for the higher education of Black men. The following year, at the first annual convention of the Free People of Color in Philadelphia, a white pastor and abolitionist, Simeon Jocelyn, along with leaders of the Black community in New Haven, would successfully nominate New Haven as the location for the proposed college. Within days of the supporters of the college petitioning for donations in newspapers and just, the news of the proposed college spreading throughout the region, the mayor of New Haven at the time, Dennis Kimberly, called for a meeting of the city's free men to discuss what he called the scheme for a Negro college in their city. At the meeting in New Haven City Hall on September 10th, 1831, the free men of the city voted to condemn the proposed Negro college with an overwhelming majority of 700 to 4. Immediately following the meeting, members of the white community rioted in Black neighborhoods and vandalized the homes of the few white men who had supported the college. The goal of my research project was to argue that on this abnormally hot day in September of 1831, the property-owning white men of New Haven, the vast majority of whom had strong connections to Yale University, acted in concert to establish a racial barrier to higher education. In this way, Yale and its leading supporters used the racial bar not simply to exclude free Blacks from higher education, but to affirm universities as the sole purview of the wealthy and powerful. So to fully understand how the proposed Negro College in the City Town Hall meeting was the creation of a racial barrier, we have to kind of dive into the history of antebellum North and primarily the history of gradual emancipation in Connecticut. In 1784, the Connecticut State Legislature passed legislation for the gradual emancipation of slavery. While Connecticut itself would not be rid of slavery until 1850, free Black people in the North began to migrate to urban areas and take advantage of this newfound freedom to try to advance their social status and quality of life. While free Black people in the North as a whole were being economically and socially oppressed, a small number were able to take advantage of weakening restrictions on economic and political mobility. Historian Hilary Moss writes, "To white dismay, the excruciating process of gradual emancipation in Connecticut had initiated had been steadily eroding the legal and occupational strictures that fixed Blacks' physical, social, and economic mobility. This fear of social upheaval caused by a growing and empowered free Black community, along with the belief that this community was disorderly and reliant, became the basis of white attempts to formalize restrictions on free Black people. Throughout the 18th century in Connecticut, property-owning free Black people had enjoyed the right to vote, but in 1814, the state legislature voted to deny suffrage to all Black residents of the state. And while other New England states would revoke the voting rights of portions of their Black populations in the early 19th century, with the passage of this law, Connecticut became the only state in the region to deny the right to vote to all Black men. So as states began passing legislation that emancipated enslaved people, it's becoming clear that white Americans were grappling with what this freedom meant for their own lives. In the name of preserving the purity and decency of their communities, white leaders worked to construct a rigid, racialized social structure that placed free Black people at the bottom of society. The common consensus in the North was that free Black people were a detriment to an already vulnerable society. Few Northern whites believed that Black people would ever become productive members of society. Black leaders understood that these accusations of moral depravity and economic dependency were not a result of any innate flaw in Black people, but rather of widespread poverty and a lack of educational or community organizations serving Black communities. In 1824, Black leaders in New Haven addressed the needs for Black religious, educational, and community organizations when free Black men Prince Duplex, Scipio C. Augustus, William Lanson, and Bias Stanley, along with a local white minister, Simeon Jocelyn, formed the African Ecclesiastical Society. The society purchased a small building at 105 Temple Street, which is actually around the location that I'm zooming in from my apartment today on the corner of Crown and Temple, which is just a fun fact I discovered in my research. This society, the building that they purchased on 105 Temple Street would later become the Temple Street Church, the first Black church in the state. And one of the primary missions of the church was to provide the Black community of New Haven with increased access to primary education. The primary source of donations from this white community in New Haven was the African Improvement Society, which was founded by Theodore Dwight Woolsey and Reverend Leonard Bacon, both prominent members of the white community, and Theodore Dwight Woolsey, obviously a prominent member of the Yale community. And so while these ministers supported efforts to uplift the free Black community, this did not translate to support for Black citizenship rights in the new nation. So even as the African Improvement Society continued to be a major source of funding for the Temple Street Church, one of the main benefactors, Leonard Bacon, declared in 1828 that attempts to produce a general and thorough amelioration of character and condition of the free people of color would inevitably be essentially fruitless. So it was clear that New Haven, that the white elite benevolence towards free Black people in New Haven had a line in the sand that they would not cross. And so even as access to primary education in the city increased, opportunities for both vocational and higher education remained out of reach. So without access to higher education or vocational training, Black New Haveners could either work servile jobs for the white elite, many of whom had strong connections to Yale, or compete with English and Irish immigrants for the worst paying skilled jobs. To try to kind of address this, in 1831, white abolitionists Simeon Jocelyn, along with members of the free Black community in New Haven, approached the first annual convention of the Free People of Color with a plan to address this need for both vocational and higher education. They proposed the funding of the school for Black men in New Haven, Jocelyn writing that the school would combine agricultural, horticultural, and the mechanic arts with the study of literature and the sciences. So the point I'm trying to make here is that it's clear that this proposed Negro College in New Haven was a direct continuation of efforts from Black leaders in New Haven to increase opportunities for education for members of their community. Eventually, New Haven was chosen as a location for this radical project for various reasons. The city's business connections to the Caribbean could attract students from the newly freed people in the area. New Haven's proximity to Yale and its commitment to education would make it easier for the college to find qualified teachers. Additionally, Jocelyn advocated for New Haven as the optimum location for the college because of the sober and Christian qualities of the white community in the city, a community that had, quote, enthusiastically championed the benevolent movements of the age, especially temperance, colonization, and education. This benevolence would only stretch so far, however. Immediately following the first annual convention of the Free People of Color, supporters of the Negro College began petitioning for donations from both Black and white Americans. It is these petitions that spurned, as I said, the mayor of New Haven at the time, Dennis Kimberly, to call for a meeting at the town hall where the free men of the city would take into consideration a scheme for the establishment of the college. So on September 10th, more than 700 property-owning white men packed themselves into City Hall despite the excessive heat and fiercely debated the soundness of the Negro College. They would eventually vote down the proposal 700-4 with no Yale professors, with the exception of Ezra Stiles, endorsing the college. The strength of their conviction against the proposed college was so strong, they vowed to combat the proposed college by every legal means. They would later go into Black neighborhoods and, destroy businesses and essentially threaten the Black community with violence if they ever overstepped their bounds again. So in the 1830s, preserving the prestige of a Yale degree was, following the meeting, the Connecticut Herald wrote, "It is well known that most of our prosperity is derived from our existing literary institutions." So it's clear that Yale's presence in the society, and it's clear that of the 700 members who voted down the college based off connections to Yale, Yale's connections to the clerical institutions of the society, of the city, and a number of other things, the main reasons for voting down the college was the preservation of Yale University and the preservation of the educational institutions in the city. And while I can't make the same historical argument that of the people who rioted later after the meeting held strong connections to Yale, it is clear that they too were worried about the effects the Black college would have on the institution. I'm noticing I'm running out of time and can't hit on all of what I wanted to say, but to wrap up, I would say it is important that we view this failed proposal for a Black college in New Haven not as a missed opportunity, but rather as a historical moment in which the racial barriers to an exclusivity of higher education were cemented, a historical moment that would have lasting ramifications throughout the country. After the City Hall meeting over the next decade, Washington, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston would all take steps to limit Black education. 2 years after the events of 1831, the town of Canterbury in Connecticut erupted over the establishment of a proposed boarding school for Black girls. Residents vandalized the proprietor of the school's home and attempted to set the school building on fire. So it's clear that this event had ramifications for not just the antebellum North, but for the country as a whole and its understanding of race and of social status, and one that Yale played a key role in.
Thank you so much, Miguel. Patrick, over to you.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for everyone for joining. This is wonderful. I'm glad that we're all able to present our research. So my project and my essay is on James Silliman College, who is an alumnus of Yale College. He didn't graduate. He attended for 2 years and then transferred to the University of Virginia. And so his story starts in Virginia with parents who opposed slavery. Obviously not a super common view at the time, especially in Virginia. And his parents freed their slaves. Then they had some, and they paid for them to go to Liberia or to go to Ohio. And so, he grew up in a colonizationist family. His family also didn't want their children to grow up in an area that, had slaves and a pro-slavery stance. And he was one of the older ones. But when he and his wife got married, everyone else in the family left to move to Indiana. And so that's kind of his background, right? And so I think that's an important starting point. And so that's his family, opposed slavery in Virginia, not the most common thing in the world. He comes to Yale, attends Yale for 2 years, transfers to the University of Virginia, gets his law degree, moves to Cincinnati, Ohio, which is kind of straddling the North and the South in a way, right, on the border with Kentucky. Practices law there for a couple of years, becomes kind of an expert in commercial law, and eventually moves back to Charlottesville, Virginia, to teach at the University of Virginia and to teach law. And so he was the second law professor at the University of Virginia, in the sense that before him, there had only been one law professor. And so John Minor was the law professor at the time when he moved there, and Holcomb worked as an adjunct and then was hired. And after that, Holcomb wasn't really known for commercial law as it is. I mean, I'm sure there are people that enjoy commercial law, but his passion instead was political speeches, and he'd give speeches to different kind of political organizations in the area, state conventions, that kind of thing. And so that's the bulk of where my research went. I think it's really important that whenever we're looking at historical figures, that we look at their own words. And so we have a lot of evidence of that. The Beinecke has some of his speeches that were printed, as well as manuscripts and archives. And so I can read a little bit from his speech. So his first, one of his first big speeches was in 1860, right? So in 1860, it's in the lead up to the presidential election. It's in Charlottesville, and he likes to talk about a great popular revolution. And so he thinks that there's all of this public opinion that's promoting slavery. And so the title of his speech is "The Election of a Black Republican President, an Overt Act of Aggression on the Right of Property of Slaves. The South urged to adopt concerted action for future safety," which is a really long title, but basically what it says is no Republicans bad. You can't infringe on our property rights. And it's kind of funny, though, his political speeches, even though he has a background in commercial law, and you might think that maybe he's going to try to make some really nuanced, kind of nasty points about why property rights, should be there, and, pull out things like that. Really, he doesn't. What he ends up doing a lot of the time is he just says, oh, well, slavery is natural. There's a natural hierarchy between Black people and white people. And, well, we already have these slaves, and so we can keep them. And if anybody tries to infringe on that right, well, then that's their fault. They're going to start a war. And there's no room for any kind of discussion. It's just that he says that this is what we have. This is basically our God-given right, as people like to say these days. And, he uses phrases like justice and truth to describe his cause. And then kind of often turns towards Republicans and just calls them sectional, and says that they're just trying to divide us, which is a message, we hear a lot. But he uses like the Missouri Compromise, or the Missouri Controversy, as he calls it, as an example of those tensions. And he says, that he talks a lot about like the constitutional rights of slaveholders. So obviously he's not really like a luminary thinker at this time. He's just kind of towing the line. And however, though, like he says all of these things in his speeches, and he has much more incendiary words as well. And he's known at the University of Virginia for being basically like the most pro-slavery professor on campus, which is quite a statement at the University of Virginia at the time. And so we have all of this evidence of what he says, none of which has any redeemable quality about it. It's all just unequivocal that, whites are superior, that Black people should be slaves. It's God's way to do that. It will never change. And if it does, we're going to go to war with you, and it's going to be your fault. And so we have all of this. And my argument that I make in my paper is that it's really the institutions that shape us. So like there are figures at Yale, like John C. Calhoun, for example, where you can make pretty clear ties between him and the university. Okay, well, this is, he learned in this class and did yada, yada, yada. And, we can tie Yale and slavery together. And like in Miguel's project, for example, he does like a really detailed account of like, this is, the university's influence on these people, and this led to this event, and that led to not having a Negro college in New Haven. With Holcomb, I think it's a little bit more of like a quote regular story, and one that there's not as much evidence for, saying that like he sat in this class on this day, and that led to him making, this ideology apparent in his speeches later on. However, there are so many people that went through Yale at this time, right? Thousands of people over time that have gone through the university, and part of the university's responsibility is to educate. And it seems like they really failed in this sense. They took somebody that came from a family that opposed slavery, and he came for 2 years and was surrounded in the aftermath of the Negro College vote. He was at Yale a couple of years after that, and he was surrounded by lots of people whose parents owned slaves, even if his parents didn't, and lots of people who, even if their parents didn't directly own slaves, their family was very much profiting off of the slave trade, and that may have been the reason that they were able to attend a university like Yale at the time. And so part of what I want to do is kind of imagine, well, what if it was a different world? What if it was the case that the university took like a little bit more of a moral stance towards slavery, and maybe they tried to make up a class of students that wasn't just singularly profiting off the slave trade, and wasn't producing graduates that would then go on and do that. And that maybe they took like a little bit more of a critical role. And so I think that as we get into our questions, we can talk about that more in the through line between, how it was back then to how it is now. But that's just a quick summary.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Mackenzie, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Just 1 second, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I guess I can only see the panels right now, but do you guys see the first slide?
Great.
Wonderful. All right. Echoing my fellow presenters, thank you so much for the opportunity to share my research. This class was really formative in how I kind of think about Yale and Yale's role in New Haven, and it was an honor to spend so much time with the archive. So I do write my paper and do my research on Yale's Civil War Memorial, which is in the center of campus. It is located in Memorial Hall, which is now part of the broader Schwartzman Center, highly trafficked area, and it was intentionally put there because the Memorial Committee decided that this is something that needed to be seen every day by everyone who walked through Yale. It's something that they were intensely proud of. It came shortly after the university's bicentennial, and it was one of the first memorials of its kind. It is unique because of this. This is the memorial inscription to the men of Yale who gave their lives in the Civil War. The university has dedicated this memorial that their high devotion may live in all her sons, and that the bonds which now unite the land may endure. The men of Yale who gave their lives in the Civil War refers to not just those who gave their lives for Union forces, but also those who served in the Confederacy. There were 114 youths who died fighting for the Union Army, and an additional 44 who died fighting for the Confederacy. In total, a quarter of Yale military-age students fought in the Civil War, and that made it the largest proportion of any academic institution in the country. So Yale was already playing a really big role in the war from a military perspective while it was happening. And this is what began to happen after the war. The war ended early 1865, and shortly after commencement that year, Yale hosted a dinner honoring Union veterans and Yale students and alumni who died for the Union Army. So specifically a sectional dinner. They also, a month after that, established a memorial committee dedicated to putting up something honoring these Union soldiers at Yale. And again, important to emphasize here that this was specifically about Union forces at this time. The memorial committee met, and they met, and they met, and as committees often do, they didn't get a lot done. Meanwhile, at Yale's peer institution, Harvard, parents and alumni fundraised to erect a memorial hall to Union veterans within 3 years. And I say this just to emphasize what was going on in other places at the time. But Yale didn't do anything. The committee languished for decades, in fact. The only known thing is that they intended to put some sort of Civil War memorial in Battelle Chapel. Anyone who has been to Battelle Chapel can confirm that there is no memorial to the Civil War or Yale veterans of the Civil War in that space. But what was going on in the country at that time is really interesting. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Memorial Day celebrations tended to be intensely sectional. You had celebrations in the North, you had Confederacy celebrations in the South, but around the 70s and especially into the 80s, that began to change. The tenor went away from sectional memorials and towards more of a patriotic reconciliation, where Memorial Day was not about those who died defending or opposing slavery, but rather those who died because they believed in something greater than themselves, because they had some sort of shared valor or bravery. And that's what takes us to the turn of the century. But on Yale's campus, that's not going over so well. The Yale Daily News publicized an editorial criticizing the lack of remembrance on campus and had itself gathered the names of 25 students who died for the Union Army at Yale. But beyond that, there was no broader effort at Yale at the time to figure out who actually died, figure out what happened to them, what they fought for, or where they were fighting. And this takes us to Yale's bicentennial, 1901. Yale constructs this memorial hall. There is no memorial to be placed in there yet, but there seems to be an onus at Yale towards memorializing something, which brings us to 1909. And that's the establishment of the Yale Memorial Committee, which was led by sitting US President Taft, who was a Yale College alumnus. But this was coming just months after he was inaugurated. So the fact that a sitting US president was taking such an interest in what was happening at Yale is pretty significant in terms of the university's relationship to national politics. And the memorial was erected 6 years later. So I just want to run through the initial committee members just to give people an idea of who was making decisions about this memorial. So the first 7 of the initial 14 were nominated again by the United States president. 5 of them held prominent positions in Connecticut or federal government, including Baldwin, who was the governor of Connecticut, McClung, who served as a secretary in Taft's administration, and just 4 of them were from the South. But the ones who were from the South were especially significant, namely General Gordon, whose quote here I think kind of encapsulates the entire sentiment and onus that was going on in this committee, which is my understanding of the proposal, blah, 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 is to recognize the fact that each was true to his principles and each deserved equal tribute of praise, and that Yale University wished to proclaim this fact to the world, that the mingled dust of both armies created a solid foundation for the future of the nation. General Gordon fought for the Confederacy. His college best friend, Judge Howland, fought for the Union Army, and they reunited at this memorial committee. So there were three main debates that the Memorial Committee underwent. The first was what to call the war. The preferred moniker at the time that the war was actually being fought was War Between the States, and that began to transition to civil war nationally and also regionally in Connecticut in the several years after the war. But at the time that the initial committee was established, the 1865 committee that set up the dinner, War Between the States was the only moniker. And then Civil War became kind of the national trend, and it was more the United Daughters of the Confederacy that still was arguing for war between the states by the turn of the 20th century. There was brief discussion also of titling the war War of the Rebellion, which a lot of the northern members of the committee felt was accurate, but would be so distasteful to the southern members of the committee and also the broader southern population that Yale was trying to bring back to New Haven because there was a steep decline in southern enrollment and southern faculty members after the Civil War, that was pretty much just brushed off from this onset. The second debate that the committee underwent display the ranks and titles. So obviously based on the committee composition and documents about their initial calls to alumni, there was always an intent to memorialize both Union and Confederate veterans in the memorial, but it was not entirely clear how they were going to distinguish that. And the Southerners won this battle. Namely, they didn't distinguish at all. The names of Yale Civil War veterans are listed chronologically by academic department, and it includes their rank. So if you want to really kind of get in there as a viewer and decide that you're going to figure out whether people were serving the Union or Confederacy, you could, but it's not altogether obvious. And this does two things. It, one, obscures the fact that there were over twice as many Yale students who fought for the Union or Confederacy, and two, equates them morally. And that's the biggest thing that I'll get into with the third debate, which is the inscription language. And I don't think that there's necessarily one here because the debates are so illuminating about the committee's overall purpose to, one, follow this national trend towards patriotic reconciliation. The memorial is happening at the semi-centennial of the war. You have a US president who is going around the country saying, you know, we're all brothers here. We all fought for these kind of broader shared ideals. Everybody was brave. And you also have this priority on campus of appeasing both the Southern committee members and also Southern students that Yale is attempting to re-recruit. So here are a couple of like 6 of 19-ish early drafts of the inscription that are still surviving in the archives. I understand that they're a bit difficult to read. These were the easiest archives to read of everything that I looked at, unfortunately. But a couple things I want to call attention to. One, all of the early drafts had some sort of phrase like each for the cause he deemed the right. And that's in reference to people who died in the Civil War, both Union and Confederate. So that's an explicit reference to the cause that people were fighting for. It's not going nearly as far as to say what historians now agree, that slavery was the cause of the Civil War. It's not, slavery is not mentioned in any of the committee correspondence that I read, none of the notes. This is not a surprise, but this is at least a reference to the fact that people had specific and different motivations for going into the war. Secondly, nearly all of the early drafts had an explicit reference to Union and Confederacy, again emphasizing that there were two sides to this war and that Yale students fought on both sides. Neither of those things appear in the final version of the inscription. And the reason that I think this is so significant is that, one, the university had an opportunity to at least hint at the causes, at least hint that there were divisions, but the purpose, the explicit purpose of this memorial, both nationally and at Yale, was to emphasize that everybody was in this together, which is a blatant historical inaccuracy. And again, they also chose not to include references to Union or Confederacy for entirely the same purpose. And I think that that attitude is best summed up by this presentation speech. Baldwin was governor of Connecticut when he served on the committee. He also chaired the committee for its last year. And he said, perhaps it was well, for as the years went on, they brought us to a viewpoint impossible in 1865. We now see that on each side of that fearful struggle, good men fought for a cause which to them seemed the cause of duty, the cause of right. This quote, the viewpoint impossible in 1865, is an explicit reference to the fact that there were hot sectional tensions immediately following the war. It would not have been possible in a northern state overwhelmingly liberal state, liberal for its time, to have erected a memorial to both Union and Confederate veterans at Yale. And the committee is expressing its gratitude for the 50 years that passed since the war, that it took Yale to erect a memorial at all, that it's now possible for us to set back, to see that there were equal men on both sides, equal bravery on both sides. And I think that that's a real shame, to say the least, that that's the kind of historical viewpoint that we've arrived at Yale. This memorial still stands in the center of Yale's campus, and it is now surrounded by the names of more than 1,000 veterans of other wars, dating from the American Revolution to the Vietnam War, and is virtually indistinguishable. So as you can make of that what you will about Yale's attempts to memorialize the Civil War, its emphasis on playing a role in national politics, national politicians' interest and influence at Yale. It was a fast topic to look into. I would encourage you next time you're on campus to walk through and try to find the memorial. And with that, I will turn it back over to Michael for questions.
Thank you so much, Mackenzie, Patrick, and Miguel. If you want to stop sharing screen, perhaps, Mackenzie. Thank you.
Thank
And we have a number of questions. And again, encourage people to use the Q&A function for questions, but let me start, and we'll ask all three of our student researchers to address these questions. And I think, you know, for all of us, if we think about this, these three really wonderful presentations each speak to the fact that Yale and no university is an island unto itself. So in your own ways, you all situated Yale in a regional and national context and in place. And also they all tie together, I think. But I want to ask you, what through line, sort of institutional history through line, do you see, particularly from the story of the 1831 college through to the next 80 years or so in the Civil War memorial in the early 1900s? And maybe we'll go in the same order. So Miguel, if you want to tackle that first, sort of reflect across these stories, what through lines institutionally you may see.
Yeah, I think one through line that really stands out to me is Yale's unwillingness or kind of the desire of Yale to not take a direct stance in the great debates of time. Right now we're dealing with slavery was particularly, but I think in my own research, you know, coming across a lot of prominent Yale members of the Yale community arguing that the proposed college would enrage South Carolina. Dennis Kimberly actually references South Carolina directly in his response to the proposed college, saying that a Negro college in New Haven would be an attack against the institution of slavery in South Carolina. So I think, you know, when we think about Yale's political positions, it's often, you know, easy to say, oh, well, they just, you know, went with the times or with the natural progression of political debates. But I think primarily with both Patrick and Mackenzie's presentation, it's clear that Yale, you know, kind of getting behind the medium compromise, or the answer that would ruffle the least amount of feathers, was actually a political action that had ramifications for people. So even though they were, you know, trying to affect the nation only through education and were wary against you know, attacking slavery in the South, that middling position that Yale has taken through a lot of its history had a direct effect, in my case, primarily on Black New Haveners. And I'm going to open up to my other panelists to discuss the other effects it had, but kind of going with the times was a political choice that had historical ramifications. And so it's not enough to just, you know, brush aside Yale actions and say, oh, well, that was the thought of the time, because it was the thought of the time partly because Yale supported it.
Great, thank you. Patrick, your thoughts on through line across time of these stories?
Yeah, I want to echo Miguel. I think he hit it right on the head. I'd also say that, like in reference to that discussion of like the thought of the time, it's important to remember, as both of my other panelists have laid out, that there wasn't just one thought of the time. Maybe there's one thought that people remember and people use to justify behavior that would now be seen as abhorrent. But there's a resistance. There's a resistance in both cases to not go the way that the university went. And I mean, I think that's true then, and that's also kind of true now. Yet they still chose to go kind of the easy way, or like Miguel said, the way that appeases the most people. But I think especially as an academic institution, it's important to like think about, well, as some like a university that's supposed to be spreading knowledge, well, what kind of knowledge are they reflecting in their actions? Are they reflecting knowledge that says everybody is equal, or are they reflecting knowledge that says, well, we don't really care?
Thank you. Mackenzie, how about you?
Yeah, I would similarly echo what Patrick and Miguel just both touched on. I think my main takeaway from my research is that the status quo is a decision, and that Yale has repeatedly made that decision. I think most of my research came from looking through correspondence between committee members, drafts of inscriptions, things like that. And these were all intensely political choices. And I think that, something that I have experienced in my time at Yale is that, for better and worse, people are interested in what happens at Yale. Yale is interested in nationally. And I think the fact that this university plays such a large role in our national politics, and it was just blew my mind that the US president played a role in this memorial that stands on our campus. I think that we have a heightened moral responsibility, and I think that this university has historically abdicated that responsibility in favor of the status quo.
Thank you, all three. I have to say, I appreciate what you all said. And Mackenzie, your line has stuck with me. The status quo is decision. Thank you for that framing. To all three of you, and maybe we'll go in reverse order this time, start with you, Mackenzie. It's been said that history may not repeat, but it does rhyme. And so thinking and building off of what you've just said, what resonance do you think and do you find for Yale and or New Haven and or the nation today in 2022 in these stories that you've been sharing, the debates about the Black College, the Civil War Memorial, Yale's ties to slavery generally? How do you think what are the resonances for those actions and the discussions around them in our own time? Mackenzie, if you might be willing to lead off in reflecting on that.
Yeah, I think that, my research that I presented on has had me thinking a lot about what it means to memorialize something, what it means to memorialize it in the moment. I saw a question in the Q&A box about when Harvard did it. Harvard's memorial went up 3 years after the war, and is a reflection of its political moment, just as Yale's went up 50 years after is a reflection of the political moment of 1915, the semi-centennial of the war. And it makes me think about Black Lives Matter memorials that are going up now, whether that's performative or means anything more. Makes me think about statues that go up on campus. Yale is constantly changing its space. This is not a place that's like set in stone. And I think it's really significant, who we're choosing to honor on buildings. There are lots of questions and conversations happening at universities across the country about that. So I think that's kind of my main takeaway from my research in the present day. And something that we had the opportunity in our class to visit the Yale Center for British Art and look at a painting of Elihu Yale and an enslaved child. Are actively researching and discovering new things about that painting. And so then what does it mean for us to present that? What should the tag at the museum say? I think these are all active conversations that we're having. We are not in a separate historical trajectory from all that we just presented on. And so I think it has caused me to reflect pretty deeply on what it means to be currently at this university and watch these kind of memorialization things happening in real time.
Thank you, Patrick.
I really like that line, Michael, that history may not, repeat itself exactly, but it does rhyme. I think that these days history rhymes with donors. History rhymes with the Brady-Johnson program and grand strategy. It rhymes with all of the instances when the university bows to even the things that it pretends to espouse, which often are really good things, and instead chooses to take money from people as if it doesn't already have enough. I mentioned Brady-Johnson just because that's the instance of, a professor teaching social movements in a class about grand strategy, which is kind of like a geopolitical practical class. And some donors decided that they didn't think it was a good idea that social movements were being taught and that the professor could speak out against Donald Trump. And, they basically forced her out. And so I think that, that was this year, right? Or that was, I guess, 2021. But this stuff isn't in our past all the way, right? So like a couple of years, I believe, or very soon after the Negro College was defeated in New Haven, Yale started its first capital campaign. And that's one thing from the course that's really stuck with me. And it's not like there was some intricate link, as far as I know, between those two events, but the university doing abhorrent things and then trying to raise money is not new. I think that looking at wealth inequality in the city of New Haven, it's the same way. A university that has an endowment that I believe is above $40 billion now. There are people starving in New Haven. There are people that are not housed. There are people that don't have healthcare. There are people that are being marginalized every day by cops, by other people, by the university, in terms of stealing land. And, there are all of these issues, and Yale kind of claims to be for humanity, right? That's their capital campaign. But I think it's important to remember that there's a human face to the oppression that the university engages in and lets happen.
Miguel, thoughts on 2022 and resonances from stories of the past?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest takeaways for me from my research project was this kind of clear line in the sand of where white benevolence ended and where Yale's benevolence ended. I didn't get to touch on this very closely, but many of the people who supported efforts to increase primary education in New Haven came out firmly against the proposed Negro College for beliefs that it would negatively affect the white institutions of the city. There's one comment in a newspaper that says the white New Haveners, support any efforts to help the Black population of New Haven, but will not, use language, cut off their own nose to help the Black community. And when I think about 2022, I think, what standard do we hold this institution to, right? Do we hold it to the same, benevolent donations to certain causes, or do we hold it to a higher standard of, as the premier institution, one of the premier institutions in this country, setting an example for how these institutions should benefit the city around them? I think it's very clear from the history that Yale was, willing to donate some money some different places, but not really do anything that would danger their status or reputation. When I think about current events, I think about highly publicized Yale donations to the city of New Haven, these other different things that are to me seem resonant, or if not history repeating itself, to me rhyme with the donations leading up to the College of 1831. And I think, we have to ask ourselves, it's easy to look back at the past and say, well, a proposed college for Black men, for higher education of Black men, was too radical and never going to happen in 1831. But I think the truth we need to reckon with is that if Yale and the members of the Yale community had really put their support behind the proposed college, it truly could have happened. And so when we think about holding Yale to a standard today, it's not just, what are some ethical, benevolent things Yale could do, it's also what is the most radical thing that we must hold this institution to, and also recognizing that if we are only expect Yale to do things that are aligned with its goals and desires, that's not enough. That some of the things that we must ask an institution like Yale to do will have a negative effect on the endowment, or could lower the prestige, or God forbid, drop us a couple rankings in the AP poll. And that these are the types of things that if Yale wants to reckon with its history and primarily wants to repair and mend its relationship to Black New Haven, it must start doing.
Thank you all. Number of questions from our audience members, and I'll quote two directly about the Civil War Memorial. And while to Mackenzie, I think all three may have thoughts. So Patrick and Miguel, after Mackenzie responds, if you have comments, certainly feel welcome to share them. So the two questions, and again, quoting directly from audience members, one a faculty member, one another audience member. The first is, do you have thoughts on how Yale might, quote, revise the language on the Civil War Memorial? Should it at all? If so, how? And then the second question, is there any movement on campus to remove or at least formally contextualize the Woolsey Civil War Memorial? So you don't have to address those directly, you can, but those questions, Mackenzie, as prompts to how you think it should be contextualized, should it be contextualized? And again, Patrick and Miguel, if you have thoughts as well, but Mackenzie, first to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions. Short answer to the second one is no, not to my knowledge. My expectation would be that most people at Yale who walk past the memorial every day don't notice that it exists, in part as a function of the fact that the entire memorial hall is covered in names. I referenced this, I think, at the end of my presentation, but there are now memorials to Yale dead from the American Revolution to the Vietnam War. So over 1,000 names in the hall. So I would say most students are probably not even aware that the Civil War Memorial exists. I don't think that Yale should revise it. I think that would be obscuring the erasure that Yale already engaged in by erecting a memorial like this in the first place. So I think that similar to what I referenced, that we visited this painting in class, and the museum is having conversations about what they should be writing next to the painting. I think that there is definitely something to be said, and I think I would support some sort of like formal plan or explanation of the Civil War Memorial Committee, who was on it, how they decided what they did. And I would hope that some research that this Yale and Slavery Work Group does can contribute to that. Unfortunately, we're working with a limited historical record, and you are fed everything by the perspective of the people who wrote the primary source documents that you're looking at. And so we can only draw as many conclusions as we can from those, but I think that there's a substantive enough record that I was able to look through from my presentation and my research that the university could definitely do something to that end. But I think that would be much more appropriate than trying to somehow remove the memorial or change the language that was so clearly deliberately decided upon at the time.
Thank you so much. Patrick or Miguel, thoughts on contextualization? Okay. A question to all three of you, jumping off of what Mackenzie said, working in the archival record. I wonder if each of you might just give a quick tip. That our audience has people who are in the archives all the time, and it has people who've never done work first person in an archive. And I wonder, as students who have so richly used the archives on campus, if you might give a tip from your own work, things you've learned about the practice of doing archival research. Patrick, if I might put you on the spot first.
Sure. And I'm by no means an expert, but I think in our class, we were able to visit the Beinecke, and you, Michael, were very, very helpful in kind of getting us oriented to those documents. I think that probably the biggest tip, and this isn't a very concrete tip, but I think it's helpful to remember that these documents were at one time, like the modern documents, and just recognizing them as like a living, not technically living, breathing, but kind of a living, breathing emblem of what has happened in the past is really important.
Great, thank you. Miguel.
Yeah, I think, my biggest takeaway, I'll throw two. One trick, I loved newspaper databases. I was shocked by how many, different, very like newspaper databases that had newspapers ranging from very small to very large. So, my tip would be when your eyes start to hurt from reading too much handwriting, you can always give the newspaper archives a quick look-see. And then my second thing I think would be, I spent a lot of time trying to fit primary sources into an arc and into a kind of storyline. And I think what I had to realize is that, the primary sources will fall into place and that you kind of just have to keep digging, and it might seem like an endless process, but then you stumble upon one that like illuminates the road ahead, and you can feel better about how bad your eyes hurt.
Great. Mackenzie.
Similarly to Patrick, I had not really worked with the archives before ever, so this is kind of my first entree into Yale's archive, which is a tremendous archive. I think that one thing is budget time for reading old handwriting. That was a surprisingly difficult thing for me. I think the biggest thing is, one, you don't know what you don't know. So unfortunately, you'll probably have to look through many, many, many boxes of archives that are labeled with committee notes 1, committee notes 2, and just kind of sift through, and a lot of it will be useless to you. Take pictures of everything as you go through, and label your pictures, have some sort of sorting system for your pictures would have been intensely helpful for me. But I think the biggest thing is, like, especially for me, I was looking primarily at committee correspondence and notes that were entirely written by decision makers and people in power. And I think that this is a general fault of most historical archives. And so kind of remembering the archives that don't exist and were not allowed to exist, and trying to make room for at least including or alluding to those perspectives to the extent that you can, based on what you do have in front of you in your research, was kind of one of the big things that we talked about in the class. And that was pretty important to me as I attempted to kind of fit together all of these things that came from governors and university presidents and US presidents and stuff like that, is remembering that this is a very finite number of people, incredibly powerful people, incredibly white and male and wealthy people who got to put together the things that we now consider to be this like trove in the archive. That was my main takeaway. Yeah.
All three of your reflections about archival practice are quite marvelous. So thank you for that and for the work you've done. I wanted to also sort of ask, for many people looking at this story, this is really a first encounter. And again, in the audience, we have people who are seasoned scholars, but we also have people who are encountering the story of Yale and New Haven and Connecticut and slavery and sort of New England and Northern engagement and complicity. And I wonder whether it's from the syllabus and texts that Professors Feimster and Rugemer had for you, or others that you've come across in your own research, if you might have a book or two that you would suggest as one of the places for people who are interested in learning more to start. So what one or two texts would you have at the top of your bibliography for those looking to really get grounded in this area of Yale and Connecticut, New England, and slavery? Miguel, maybe start with you.
Sure. The first, kind of book that jumps to me is In Hope of Liberty, James Oliver Horton and Lois E. Horton, which is about free Black people in the antebellum North. The experiences of free Black people in the antebellum North was not something that I had interacted with a lot. I think, like many people, my historical education about the antebellum period rested on plantation slavery in the South and leading up to the Civil War. So grounding myself in the experiences of free Black people in the antebellum North and in the traditions of Black activism in the antebellum North was incredibly helpful. So I will drop that in the chat.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks so much. Mackenzie, a book or two that you would recommend?
I think one of the most useful books for me, which was on the syllabus, was Ebony and Ivy, which gave a really kind of good historical context of the role that racial slavery played in the foundation and development of elite academic institutions like Yale. Like a big takeaway from one of the chapters that we were assigned to read in class is that it wasn't just, you know, a couple of university administrators who were slaveholders, and that's what kind of enabled the universities to develop and grow, but rather that the entire institution of slavery was embedded into the practice of these universities and their ability to exist, from the people who could afford to send their children to who could afford to be a professor, to study to be a professor, all of that. So I think that was a really good kind of broad context, not Yale specific, but kind of made me think about where the conversation needed to start and how far back we needed to go to talk about things like the Civil War memorial that came centuries later.
Great. So Dr. Wilder's book, fantastic. Thank you. Patrick, how about you?
I'll round out the syllabus a little bit with, I'd recommend Complicity, How the North Promoted, Prolonged, and Profited from Slavery by Ann Farrow, Joel Lang, and Jennifer Frank, all reporters of the Hartford Courant. I believe they wrote this article after it was revealed that the Courant had posted fugitive slave ads and had profited from the sales of those ads. And so they did like a deep dive investigation. And the book is like a quicker read than something like Ebony and Ivy, but still incredibly helpful. In that, like, oftentimes we don't just think, when we think of slavery, we think of the South, and we think of just cotton plantations, but Complicity really put in kind of the whole economy of slavery, and that included a lot of things in New York, merchants and, you know, other people that were profiting off of the trade. And so I think that's a really, really, really good intro to kind of the North and slavery.
Terrific. And if Mackenzie or Patrick, if you have a chance to just type the titles and authors of Dr. Wilder's book and the collective work of Complicity, that would be great. I'm sure our audience would appreciate it. We're at time. I've put in the chat link to next week's Mondays at Beinecke, which will feature a fantastic presentation on Georgia Douglas Johnson by Yale PhD student Cassidy Jones, one of a number of talks that will be done in conjunction with Brava, the new exhibition that you can see highlights of online that Melissa Barton presented at last week's Mondays at Beinecke. We will have another presentation of student researchers from the Yale and Slavery seminar on March 7th. So you can find the link to that on the Beinecke calendar of events online, and all who are on this will receive notice registration. But March 7th, we'll have 3 more students presenting. I wish I had time to read all of the comments and kudos to our student colleagues and researchers, but there are enthusiastic and numerous comments which I co-sign, and Dr. Blight, who's in the audience, has also co-signed those, and we're all grateful again for the time you've taken. I wanted to give each of you the last word and use as a prompt, if I may, a fantastic piece of writing from one of you, from Mackenzie, and I've had the pleasure of reading all 3 of the student papers, and they really are all great. But Mackenzie, there's a line that you had that I want to use as a prompt for each, and I think it's your final line, if I might quote it. You end your paper, quote, "Now, as Yale finally begins to wrestle with its complicity and perpetuation of slavery and systemic racism, it is critical that the university's forgetting be remembered." And I think that's, again, such a great turn of phrase. It is critical that the university's forgetting be remembered. So if I might use that great closing sentence from Mackenzie as a prompt to all of you, how do you think Yale's forgetting should be remembered? Miguel.
I think we've touched on this all throughout today's presentations. You know, I don't remember the exact wording you used, Mackenzie, but it was, you know, take the middle ground is a choice. I think I'm hesitant to say that Yale needs any more buildings named after people or memorials put up or any of these different things, because I think after Mackenzie's talk, you will all, be a little shocked to know that probably many students have no recognition of the historical importance of what's on the walls in the new Schwartzman Center. So I'm hesitant to say that we need any more, memorials or projects put up. I think the way to remember forgetting is by doing the opposite, which is by action and by, really doing the radical projects that Yale has forgotten that it was against. And so for me, that looks like, imagining a world in which the College of 1831 was approved and put into fruition, and what New Haven would look like if it had a historically black college right alongside Yale. And then to remember what happened in 1831, Yale should take steps to try to help bring that vision to fruition. I also think it's, incorporating the voices of those who didn't forget. I want to make it very clear that while these stories are not widely known on Yale's campus, they are remembered by the people who live in New Haven, and the people who, are still affected by Yale's actions and political stances. And so part of remembering the forgetting is by incorporating the people who do remember that into the voice of Yale and the actions Yale takes. Academia is a rigid institution with lots of different panels and groups and boards and X, Y, and Z. It's clear that the voices that are on those panels need to change. Because as much as Yale loves to forget, there are people who haven't forgotten, and those voices should be heard.
Thank you so much. Patrick.
Whenever you posed this question, I immediately thought of the oft quoted, "Then you will know the truth and the truth will set you free." But the reality is the truth doesn't set the people free that Yale has oppressed in the past. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't confront it. I think that the legacy of forgetting is something that we need to name, we need to claim it, and we need to do something about it. And I think that why is it 12 students that learned about this? Why isn't it, all 6,000 of us? And I think to go off what Miguel said, and what Mackenzie has also said, kind of this complicity is a choice, this taking the middle ground is a choice. It's also a choice every year since these events occurred that the university has decided not to change. And so that means not just was it when the Civil War Memorial was constructed that the university kind of took this milquetoast stance kind of in the middle, but it was also in 2018, in 2019, in 2020, in 2021. And they make promises. President Salovey came to our Yale and Slavery conference and said lots of things that I don't know have had material impact yet. The city of New Haven has, but beyond that, in terms of changing names or things like that. I think that's something that's kind of popular opinion right now. Like, okay, we should change the name of something. But in reality, if we decide not to try to change the economic and political conditions that have created the university, and if we don't challenge that economic and political power that's been built on the back of slaves, then we're kind of missing the point, I think.
Thank you. And Mackenzie, your response to the prompt that I gave of your good words.
Yeah, I think I would echo what both of my classmates just said. And I thought in summer 2020, it was very rich to see Yale release a lot of statements about Black Lives Matter and then ignore the Black New Haveners in its backyard. And I think that the university has made obviously substantial progress, but I think that there's a lot to be said that the inequalities that the university perpetuates today, its lack of contribution to New Haven, even though that is increasing, its lack of support for New Haven public schools relative to the university's endowment, and the list could go on, are legacies of the exact same historical through line that started at the university's founding in 1701, and that appeared at these touch points that we each focused on in our presentations. And so I think that I'm, really happy to see this Yale and slavery work group. Obviously, I enrolled in this class that does research to support the work group. I'm happy to see this work happening at universities across the country, but I don't think that it will be nearly enough to produce a manuscript or a book or a conference or something at the end of this and then wash our hands of that and say, okay, we did it, we remembered, but if we're still doing the exact same things, then what do we learn by remembering? And so I would like to see immediate action on Yale's part to rectify injustices that started at the university's founding that were perpetuated in each of these moments that we talked about and that remain today, albeit in different forms.
On behalf of everyone in our audience, thank you all. Thank you each. Have a great afternoon, and we'll look forward to seeing as many as possible in future Mondays at Beinecke. But without further ado, Mackenzie, Patrick, Miguel, thank you.